Guys, so we're being recorded, so everybody's got to be on their best behavior. Like, don't be eating when we're looking at you. You're being recorded. Just want everybody to know that. And then this is going to go on our website, so you were forever memorialized on our website. So I cannot tell you how excited I am for today. So in case you don't know who we are, although I recognize most of your faces, my name is Matt Keeman, one of the founders of Envision Consulting, and we do search and we do strategy and a lot of mergers for nonprofits. So and actually board retreats. I love board retreats because I like talking at people, as most of you know. So if you need one, I'm available. So the reason why today makes me so happy is because, first of all, I love Mitch. He's one of the, my go-to guys, such a smart, amazing guy. But also, I've been an executive director before a few times, and it's lonely. And sometimes it can suck. And you need people to go to, you need a network, right? And so today, when I was in ED, I wish I had a Mitch in my life. I wish I had something like this. And so I hope that you get just something out of today, which I know you will. And then let me just tell you really quickly, I hate it when people introduce me, so I'm going to let Mitch introduce him in a bit. But just so you know, at this point, Mitch is a consultant and also a consultant with us. But before that, he was the CEO of the Tournament of Roses. He was the executive vice president at Claremont. He was the chief of staff in the US Air Force. That's a big deal, guys. So you have a huge person here who's going to tell you all about what he's learned in his years as a CEO. So I'm expecting to see you all take copious notes. And just know, though, that at the end, you will get the slides emailed to you. So there's that. And also, this webinar will be on our website as far as I know, right, Sylvia, at some point? Or at least it will be available. And the other thing is, do me a favor, and if you have questions, put them in the chat. Alex will be keeping track of them. And then we can go over them at the end. But really think about that, because that to me is the most important part. You can ask Mitch anything you want. Just such an amazing guy. So Mitch, I so appreciate you being here, and I did not build you up enough, and it's on you. Take it away, my friend.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Let me bring up my slides and we'll see how that goes. Okay. So the title of this is What I Learned in 2 Decades as a Nonprofit CEO. Can everybody hear me? Nod your head if okay, good. The original version of this I entitled What I Know Now That I Wish I Knew Then, but we changed it for this one presentation, but it is kind of what I wish I knew then. So let's say a little bit about me. As you can see by the color of my hair, I'm an old guy. I have a 54-year work career and history, and I'm working on year number 55. 21 of those years were spent as a chief executive. 4 of those was as a commander in military organizations. I had 6 in academia, running a nonprofit that provided support services to the Claremont colleges. I had 10 years as the CEO of the Tournament of Roses, as Matt mentioned. And then I had 1 year during 2 different periods that I was the interim CEO of the Boys and Girls Club here in Pasadena. And I know we've got Ann on, so she can testify to that. And for the last 11 years, I've been a consultant to nonprofit boards and executives. So all told, I've got about 32 years in being in nonprofits or dealing with nonprofits. And I've learned a few things. So let's take a look at those. Barring some unforeseen circumstances, my time as the CEO is now over. So what do I learn that might be of interest to you? Well, the first thing I learned is that our organizations are always changing, or at least they should be. And why is that the case? Because the world around us is changing. The society is changing. We're aging. We're more diverse. Rapid technological advances. I can tell you that the offices that I go into now look nothing like the offices when I first went to work as a young second lieutenant back in 1968. You can't hardly believe that there were no computers, no cell phones, none of that stuff, no PowerPoints. The workforce is changing. There's less middle managers. The employees are younger. We'll have multiple career changes. For those of you that follow labels on generations, Gen Z is quite different from any other generation that has come before them, and it takes a lot to understand where they're coming from. There's a changing corporate climate. There's always been the emphasis on profit and loss there, but now there's more interest in social awareness and involvement with good causes. And there's a globalization of business, climate change, diseases like COVID. All of this stuff is changing rapidly around us. And sometimes if we don't step back and take a look at it, we don't sort of catch the grasp of the magnitude of the change that's going on. One of my professors in grad school was a fellow by the name of Peter Drucker. I still hope some of you are old enough to know who Peter Drucker is and what he was. But Peter was a guru of both for-profit and nonprofit organizations. And he said some of the greatest things that have ever been said about how to manage nonprofits. Well, one of the things that he said is when the world is changing around you like we are living in right now, he says, unless it's seen as the task of the organization to lead change, those organizations will not survive. That's a pretty harsh statement, but true. I've seen a lot of them that didn't make that cut because they weren't paying attention to the need for change. But Peter also offers us the thought that you can't manage the change that's around you. What you got to do is recognize it and stay ahead of it. But you don't get involved with trying to manage change of the world. Manage change only in your organization. And how do you do that? Well, in my opinion, there are two pillars to building and holding up a successful organization. One of those is good governance, and one of them is strategic planning. And I'm going to talk a little bit about both of those. Just so you know, this is a very condensed version of this, because both of those are separate presentations in their own right. So let's talk about pillar one, which is good governance. Governance itself is the responsibility of the organization's board of directors. It's the board carrying out their proper responsibilities. And if you don't know what those are, there's all kinds of sources online that can tell you about what the responsibilities of nonprofit boards are. And good governance is focusing on doing the right things well. That's very important. The right things well. Now, a lot of people think that governance and management, they hear those two terms and they think they're the same thing. They are not. Governance is the high-level establishment of goals, policies, and then oversight of what's happening. While management is the responsibility of the staff and the CEO, and that's for carrying out those policies and goals and programs that the governance side of the house says they ought to be doing. So here's a little example of those two. So as you see, governance, which is the top of those two gears there, they're involved with strategic direction, policy, resource allocations, and oversight. In other words, they're driving what management, which is the CEO, executive director, and the staff, because they're involved with program planning and execution, administration, resource utilization, and also helping the board carrying out their responsibilities in terms of governance. The second of our pillars is effective strategic planning. And what is strategic planning? Well, it's a process to try to visualize what's ahead down the road. And it's designed, once you see what the road looks like, we want to organize the organizational vision and priorities, build commitment among the stakeholders in the organization, and ensure that everyone is working towards the right goal. It is the unifying factor. Good strategic planning is the unifying factor that keeps us moving forward to deal with change and other management issues that are arising out there on the horizon. But unfortunately, this is how most boards look at strategic planning. And the reason they do that is because the books on nonprofit strategic planning are very thick. They're very filled with lingo, and they're very filled with complex ways to carry it out. I'm going to simplify all that. I'm going to tell you that strategic planning is basically very simple. It starts with a review of the organization's mission. Is your mission still current? So let's look back at a couple. Let's take the March of Dimes, for example. Their original purpose in life was to help people with that had suffered from polio. Well, when polio got nearly eradicated, the organization changed its mission to incorporate all sorts of birth defects. And there are others that I can give you examples of. So what you want to do is you want to make sure, well, let me go back to the Tournament of Roses. The original purpose of the Tournament of Roses was to attract settlers out to California so that they would buy land and build houses and make Pasadena a great city. Well, we're there now, and we're no longer interested in attracting large numbers of people. So that's another example of how a mission can change. Then what you want to do is you want to examine the current reality of your organization. One of the tools is what's called SWOT analysis, which says, look at your strengths, your weaknesses, which are internal examinations, and the external, it's operations and threats. And you want to identify the performance gaps in the present. That's very important. What are you not doing that's keeping you from being the great organization that you want to be? Then what you want to do is you want to envision your desired midterm future. And I say that this ought to be about a minimum of 5 and maybe 10 years. Now, that doesn't mean you're building a plan for 10 years, but it's saying what I want to be. What is my dream for the organization when we grow up? And what are the future challenges and opportunities that are arising that we're going to have to deal with? And what are the obstacles then that are in your way? So if you think about it, on the one hand, we've got where we are. On the other hand, we want to see where we want to go. And there are things called obstacles in the middle that are there to get in the way of us achieving our vision. And so what we do then is we develop organizational strategies to work around these issues to achieve our final vision. And then we create a detailed implementation plan of who's going to do what to whom, by when, in what way, and how much is it going to cost, all the details of how to implement the strategies. So that's a very simple primer on strategic planning. And yet it tells us the whole story of what you have to do. So the second thing I learned is that from Peter is that leading change is critical. And Charles Darwin, whether you're a believer in him or not, says it's not the strongest of the species that survive, or nor the most intelligent, but the one most responsive to change. And that's kind of true in nonprofit organizations. The ones that are going to be here 10, 20, 30 years from now are the ones that are going to be responsive to the change that's around us now and will be in the future. But this is not easy at all. It takes a lot of things to get to change, to leading change. The first is you'll need strong leadership. And by leadership, I don't mean one person out in front on a white horse saying, follow me. What I mean is that you need a cadre of leaders, both board and staff, who are strong in their convictions, who have courage, good interpersonal skills, and are well received within the organization. You want to pull people towards you to be your leaders in any change effort that are well respected within the organization, because they are thought leaders and they'll be bringing along others in the process. The second thing about leading change is you need to make the case for change absolutely compelling. You can't encourage people to make a whole lot of changes if you're just tweaking things around the edges. You gotta have a compelling need for doing that. And that may take educating people on what the needs are. Years ago, I was with one organization and we were pretty self-satisfied with ourselves. And then I went in and I did about a 6-month study on how the trends were and all the things that we considered important. And basically the trends in every single area that we thought were important were going in the wrong direction. And we presented that to the board, and the board was instantly on board with the need for change. So you may need to require to educate others as to why that change is needed. The second thing you got to know is that opposition is going to happen, even when it's not rational. There are some people that just don't like change at all in any way, shape, or form. And they will do what they can to keep the things the way that they are right now. But you've got to deal with these people. You got to deal with the opposition. You've got to recognize what their concerns are and tell them why you're trying to do what you're trying to do and convince them on why the house will be successful. And where you do that is obviously communications. Communications are one of the most important things in leading change in an organization. Use every method that you have at your convenience. Boards, all member meetings, newsletters, interacting forum, personal web letters, and I should have added on there social media. Whatever you have that you can communicate with people, you should be using to talk about the need for change and how you're doing in that change. And one of the effective tools is start with small things. When you're doing change, start with the things that are fairly easy to do. And then what you want to do is, as you change things, you want to track and publicize the improvements. And as you do this, some of the doubters will come on board because you're showing them how the organization is now better than it was before you started this process. So that's a very effective way to win over those that are resistant to the change at first. You also may find that having an outside consultant might help. And I am not asking for business here, but what I'm telling you is, and I have heard this said to me so many times in strategic planning efforts, that we're so glad that you're here as a consultant, because consultants can see things about the organizations that those that live with it every day don't see. And they can ask the hard questions that people that are colleagues, they can't ask one another. And so having somebody that's neutral, outside observer who's been doing this before can often help in your strategic change efforts. Now, that doesn't mean it's absolutely essential, but it's often helpful. The next thing that I learned is that every organization has a culture, just like countries. Every organization has a culture. And I'll show you an example of one of those in just a second. But it's really important that when you come in to an organization as a senior official, a CEO or a board chair or whatever, you got to know the culture of the organization. Why? Because culture defines the boundaries of what's acceptable to do within the organization. Now, you can change culture, but that's part of the change process. But until you get into that, you've got to live within the organizational culture. I have seen at least 2 or 3 occasions where the board, when they were selecting a CEO, did not pay attention to the cultural match between the person that they hired and the organization. And what happened was a disaster, because people all of a sudden that come in that aren't bought into the culture are trying to do things that don't fit within that box of acceptable action. And it's not pretty when that happens. So you got to know what the culture is and stay within it as you go along. Now, how do you figure that out? You know, there's not normally a book that says this is the culture of this organization. So what you got to do is you got to observe. You get in, and this is one of the reasons why they tell CEOs, don't start changing things the first week that you're in there. Think about things, study things, ask people. You want to observe, you want to ask, you want to study the organization. And as you do this, the picture of what that culture is will always emerge. One of the first things I do as a CEO is I go through the history. I look at all the past files. I read any history books on the organization that I can, because it tells me about the culture. So observe, ask, and study to understand what the culture is. Now, I promised you a sample of what an organizational culture might look like. For those of you in Pasadena, you'll recognize the headquarters of the Tournament of Roses. And so this is their culture. They're volunteer-led, staff-supported. That is the fundamental underlying principle of the organization. Very deliberative decision-making. No one person drives the organization. But they have very decentralized operational management. They have 33 operating committees that carry out the mission. Tradition is very precious to them, as is their brand. They're very brand aware. They're fiscally conservative and they don't like to take risks. A good example of that was way back in 1902, they had the first Rose Bowl game. And then they went to see if they were going to do it in 1953, and they decided it was too risky. And so they decided that what they would have instead was chariot races, which is not necessarily what I would have thought was the right thing to do. But it shows you that they were so concerned about the money-making potential of football that they didn't even do it for the next 14 years. And then you want to have the last thing that they have is a tradition of continual improvement. They work very hard to improve things every year, but those changes have to be evolutionary and not revolutionary. And one of the reasons is because it's very hard to change volunteer organizations culturally. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. But for me, what I think is the primary, I'm sorry, I missed this one. So the success of a culture can also be dangerous. Years ago, there was a guy by the name of Alvin Toffler that wrote a book by the name of Future Shock. Many of you may have read that. But what he basically says is that you may have been successful in the past doing things in a certain way, but the first rule of survival is that nothing is more dangerous than yesterday's success. You must be looking forward. You must see what's coming at you, and you must adapt to those changes. Now, for those of you that don't know who Joe Paterno is, he was a legendary football coach at Penn State University. Nothing could be truer for him than these words that he wrote down. The minute you think you've got it made, disaster is just around the corner. A few years after he said that, he had a scandal in the football department, some of which people went to jail, and Joe had to retire in disgrace. So the truth of what he said is absolutely applicable in his particular case. Another guy that tells us important things is a guy by the name of Jim Collins. Jim Collins wrote the book Good to Great. And if you haven't read that, it's very, very good. He also has a little book called Good to Great in the Social Sector. And it's only about 1/4 of an inch thick, and it's fabulous from start to finish. But what Jim Collins says is that greatness is a dynamic process, not an end point. The moment you think of yourself as great, your slide toward mediocrity will all have already begun. Extremely, extremely important. Don't look at the past and live on your past successes, because if you do, you're already on the way downhill. So that means that the main task of leadership in an organization is to fuel the bonfire of continual improvement. Okay, so that's all about change and managing change and leading change and understanding what's coming at you and how to lead that change within your organization. Extremely, extremely important. But that's not all that I learned. One of the other things that I learned away from the area of change is that volunteers are absolutely amazing people. I suspect that most of you on this call today rely on volunteers in one form or another. They are absolutely amazing people, but, and this is a big but, there are challenges when you're dealing and relying on a lot of volunteers. And heavens knows, when I was in the tournament, I had over 1,000 of them. And so that was pretty daunting task. I'm working with another organization now that has over 4,000 volunteers. Imagine trying to manage 4,000 volunteers. Those of us with 100 or less, already have problems. And for those big ones, it's really incredible. The first challenge that they have is recruitment. We're in a changing society. There's a lot less in the way of middle managers. And the truth be told, most nonprofits were originally formed by either middle management men who could afford the time off, or stay-at-home moms who could afford the time to work. Guess what? There's no middle management anymore, and the women are working more than the guys are. And so the society is changing, and it's not working in our favor. There's great competition for diversity. Every time that I have tried to recruit an underrepresented group, I find out that they're being recruited by 4 or 5 other nonprofit boards. So we've got to be better than the others. We've got to offer them more to convince them to come with our way. And then you have to manage expectations. And this goes both ways. We have to not over expect from our volunteers, but we have to manage their expectations as well. Motivation is key. And part of the job of the leadership of any organization is motivating the volunteers that we may have. And Jim Collins again tells us, and the more I read this, the more I realize the truth of it. Leadership, true leadership, only exists if people follow when they have the freedom not to. Think about that. Paid employees, guys in the military, we may not have the choice of following or not if we like our jobs. But when you're dealing with volunteers, they don't have to follow you. And so it's real leadership that's needed in dealing with these people. You've got to provide them an experience that's satisfying. And that means meaningful work, strong recognition programs, and perhaps a say in the organization. You could have a volunteer coordinator or a volunteer leader of your volunteers that you might want to have as a guest in your board meetings. So having a say in the organization for the volunteers will help them stay motivated. There are other management challenges as well. The first is, remember that in most cases, not always, but in most cases, the volunteers will not be professional at the assigned task. That means that you need to train them, and you need to watch and design tasks that are appropriate for the size and complexity of the situation. You also need to think about discipline. Not every person that comes on board as a volunteer is going to end up being a positive contributor to the organization. But you have very limited tools in dealing with volunteers. You can counsel them, you can cajole them, you can do a variety of things. But when the bottom line comes about, you don't really have a lot of tools in dealing with volunteers. But discipline cannot be overlooked, because volunteers that aren't paying attention to the rules or are counterproductive in the organization can lead to very, very serious problems. And so it's important for leaders to make sure that policies for your volunteers are in place. I like to recommend having a volunteer handbook that incorporates what it means to be a member, what the ethical conduct is, all of those things, and incorporates what might happen to them if they go against the policies or are disruptive into the organization. So I do recommend a volunteer handbook if you don't have one. I know that many organizations do, and I applaud those. There are also cultural impacts that volunteers bring to organizations. And one of those, and the most important of it, is that change in volunteer organizations can be very difficult. You can expect resistance if you try to change things, and you might find that it's easier not to change than it is to disrupt your volunteer corps. And I don't really know all of the psychology behind this, but the fact is that when people are in organizations and they view themselves as successful, there's a very strong psychic attachment to what they're doing and what the organization is doing. And so if you try to change things from the way that they're doing, you're likely to run into resistance. And you need to be cognizant of that and deal with that using some of the change management techniques that we talked about before. Consensus building is the key. Again, if you want to try to change in a volunteer organization, you got to go to extra lengths to educate them on why change is necessary and how it's going to benefit the organization. Let me give you an example. I one time had to start charging for an event that heretofore had been free. And I had a parade of volunteers come into me and tell me that it was immoral to charge for the on the labor of the backs of volunteers, and that I shouldn't do this, that we're not treating the clients with respect. So consensus building is very important. And what I had to tell those folks was, look, if I don't charge a little bit for this, we can no longer afford to do that event. And, you know, everybody bought that. But initially, they didn't want to charge for that event because it was a change to how they were getting their psychic reward. The next thing I learned, and this goes all the way back to my 26-year military career before I got fully into the nonprofit world. Success is all about teamwork. None of us can do this alone. Even in organizations without a staff, you still need the board to work as a team in order to get things accomplished. The military learned this a long time ago, and they have a way of bringing on board new people. And basically, the way that team building works is, the first step is you downplay the role of the individual. They point out that no one individual can do what the organization is trying to do. And even a bunch of uncoordinated individuals cannot accomplish the mission. That success is achieved by the team working together. And then once you've made them aware that they're on a team and that team success is what's important, you want to test that team to its limits. The experience is extremely special. And look at anybody that's ever been in the Marine Corps. The Marines do this better than almost anybody in the world. They test their people to the limits. SEAL teams, special forces. The experience itself becomes very special, and an amazing transformation occurs within that team. Now they're no longer a group of individuals. Now they're a team that's working together to accomplish their purpose. It's an amazing transformation, and the commitment to the organization increases exponentially in terms of the effectiveness of the team. And that's what you want to do with your volunteers. And one of the other things I learned is that the tougher the test is, the more satisfying it can become. Some of you may remember, but back in 2006, we put on a rose parade in a monsoon. It was one of the heaviest rains that I have ever seen in Pasadena. My shoes were soaked, my clothes were soaked. The floats were dripping color, flowers were falling off. It was an excruciatingly difficult test. But when it was all over, you know what? The people that went through it were as happy as they've ever been. Look at this guy in the rain suit down on the right. Look at that smile. Do you think he's proud of himself? You bet he is. And that's all being part of a team that is successful in what it does. We even published a pin that we gave out to all the volunteers that says, "I survived 2006. And those pins became extremely valuable when everybody wanted to have one. So,
excuse me, Mitch,
remember the teams.
Mitch, we have a quick question.
Yes.
So we have a question from Ann Lee, and she's asking, how do you know when the team is reaching its limits or when they are capable of more?
Well, if people start not being able to carry out the task, for example, if a whole bunch of people in a military drill are dropping out, they're failing in what they're doing. If you're seeing people that are not being successful, you need to pull back a little bit. And so you want to test to the limit. But when you sense that you're going over the limit, you need to pull back imperceptibly if you can, but in a way that they know that they're still being stressed, but you're not going too far. Does that help, Ann? Good. Okay, the next thing I learned is that if something can go wrong, it will. I have been through, in the Tournament of Roses, 2 floats that caught on fire. A dozen or so floats that couldn't go down the street without being dragged by some sort of a tow truck. And things will go wrong. So what you want to do is you want to, when you're doing your planning in an organization, you want to consider the bad along with the good. And we did that in that 2006 parade. And everybody came prepared with the right sort of rain gear. We worked with the city to make sure that the drains were clear. We did a survey of all of the parking structures along the route where we could put the bands if there was lightning in the storm. We were prepared because we thought it through. So you need to plan for the bad along with the good. And this is something that people in their strategic planning processes don't often do. But what you need to do is you develop your ideal plan, but then you've got to think about what your scenarios are. And those of you that are in the development business know that success often depends on how successful you are. And so if you're not as successful as you'd hope to be, the organization has got to be prepared. They've got to be able to figure out how they're going to deal with the adverse impacts. Let me give you an example. When I came to town back in the year 2000, there was an organization that was very big, very well-to-do, that relied heavily on donations. And for those of you that were around in those days, in 2000, there was a big downturn in the economy. And there was a big downturn in contributions to organizations. And you can go back and look this up in the history books as far as organizational donations. But what happened was the CEO saw this coming, and she went to the board and told the board, we're not going to have enough money to carry out all the programs that we've started. Because remember, in the late 90s, money was flowing into nonprofits. They almost had too much money. And they started a lot of new programs then that were nice to have, but maybe not essential. And so what should have happened is that they should have, when they heard they didn't have enough money, they should have pared back on some of those programs, but they didn't. They told the CEO to spend the reserves. And so she did, and they kept all of the programs going. The next year, the contributions were still down, and she went back to tell the board that they didn't have enough money to carry out all the programs. And the board says it's because you're a bad leader, and they fired her. It took 10 years before that organization got a semblance of its former reputation back, because they were totally unprepared for the bad along with the good. And the way you handle this is take a look at various scenarios in your strategic planning process. Or it doesn't have to be strategic. It can be your event planning process, like is shown here with our friends from Disney. You've got to be prepared for what's coming and be prepared to deal with that and have plans in place to take care of that. The next thing I learned is that nonprofits are a business. You have to make money, and you have to make more money than you spend. You've got to build a little bit of a cushion in there for rainy days and for growth and for dealing with contingencies like air conditioning failing, whatever. You need to have a little bit reserve. And I tell new CEOs to remember, nonprofit is a tax status. It is not your business strategy. And I can't emphasize this enough. You've got to keep an eye on the fiscal side of the house as well as on the mission side of the house. And they talk about this as nonprofits having a dual bottom line. The dual bottom line is, how are we accomplishing our mission and how are we financing it? So are we getting enough money to carry out the mission, and how well are we carrying it out? So remember, it's not a business strategy, it's a tax status. And we do have customers, and a lot of nonprofits don't like to use the word customer. That's okay. You can use the words beneficiaries, clients, whatever you want to, patrons, whatever you want to do. Those people are really customers. They have expectations of your performance. And what you want to do is you want to try to meet or exceed all of those expectations. And that's something that we've always tried to do in all of the organizations that I've ever been with. Promise what's reasonable and over-deliver. Never promise too much and under-deliver, or your organization is in trouble. Always work to exceed the expectations that you've established for the organization, for your staff, for your donors, whatever it is that you're dealing with at the time. Always exceed their expectations. You also need to be very disciplined in a nonprofit. There are three things that determine what you can do in a nonprofit. One is, what do you have a passion for? The second is, what do you have the ability to do? And the third is, what do you have the resources for to carry things out? It's all too easy to get caught up in that passion circle and try to do things that you really don't know how to do, or you really don't have the resources to do. So what you've got to do as a leader in an organization is you've got to focus in on, what do we have the passion for? What do we have the ability to do very well? And what do we have the resources to do? And within that red triangle that you see there, the activities that are within that are what you ought to be trying to do. And if you want to do more, what you do is you expand the size of your resources circle, and that then takes in a greater area. So more resources means that you can do more, so long as you still have the passion and the ability to carry that out. But you need to be disciplined in your expenses to be in a successful organization. I also like to tell people to prepare for departure the day you arrive. There's an old joke that I heard a long time ago that says, when you come in, or when a new successor comes in, you hand them 2 envelopes and say, you will need these envelopes down the road. Whenever you get in trouble, open the first envelope. And so you things are going a little rough, you're not happy with where things are, and so you open the first envelope and it says, blame your predecessor. And so you tell them, well, you inherited a mess, and I'm working on fixing it, but we're not there yet. So blame your predecessor, and that works. No, most of the time people will be satisfied. And then then it says, if you still having trouble, open up the second envelope. And and the guy goes along, and all of a sudden he's still having problems. He opens up the second envelope and it says, prepare 2 envelopes. So we're not talking about the 2 envelopes here. What we're talking about preparing for the future is just think about what it means to be a good manager. So right from day one, as you're evaluating the organization, you want to figure out, do I have the right team in place? Does everybody know what they're supposed to be doing? If not, I need to fix that. Have you appropriately delegated operational authorities to your subordinates? Have you properly mentored and trained those subordinates? Are they performing as they should? Is good decision-making institutionalized? Are the organization's processes, are they well-defined and well ingrained in the organization? Is the organization prepared for the future? And does the organization know how it's going to select your successor? These are the type of things that I used to try to ask myself about every 6 months. These are the questions that I said, this is my report card. How am I doing at preparing the organization? So that if I get hit by a bus on the way home, is the organization prepared to go on without me? And these are the type of things that you want to have doing the right thing for the organization. So prepare the day you arrive. You want to prepare, start preparing and start thinking about getting things in place for your departure at some point, because we're all going to leave the organization at some time. The average, I heard somewhere, I can't vouch for its accuracy, but I heard that the average length of service for a nonprofit CEO was about 7 years. So that means that somewhere between 5 and 10 years, you may have to deal with some sort of a turnover, either some personal or family tragedy, a better job comes along, some accident, whatever it might be. But it's good if you are prepared for the future, the day that you start. And the last thing that I learned, and I've done this too quickly, I talked too fast, I'm sorry, but nonprofits are great. They do everything that they have to improve the people around them. They incredible people. They're motivated. They're dedicated. They're caring. The people that you're dealing with are passionate about their organization. And that goes for staff, volunteers, beneficiaries, board members, anybody that's associated. They're incredible people that are interested in accomplishing immeasurable good for communities around the world. And you don't have to watch much of the news to see that every time there's some sort of a disaster someplace, there are nonprofit, or as Europe calls them, NGOs, non-government organizations, that are there to help take care of people, help them repair their lives, help them get medical care. They're accomplishing immeasurable good for communities around the world. And they're dealing with genuine human needs. And one of the things that I like to tell people is, if you watch society right now, what you're watching is you're watching governments in many areas pulling back from the social sector. Their social programs are often the first ones to go away. And so there are more and more human needs being assigned or being created for nonprofits to deal with. So it's kind of a dichotomy, because oftentimes nonprofits have increasing demands and decreasing resources. And that's a very bad situation to be in, but it's one that you can plan for ahead. So what I like to say is nonprofits are what makes the magic happen in our world. I firmly believe that. I don't think I understood that very much when I left the military and got directly involved in nonprofits. They make magic happen, and you all should be very, very proud of what you're doing. And I want to thank all of you for being involved with the nonprofit world and doing the things that you do to make our society as great as it is and make it better for tomorrow. So that's what I have for you today. And I'm sorry I'm a little bit early here, but the good news is that gives us time for any questions that you might want to talk about. Anybody out there?
Mitch, I have quite a few questions here. So if you want to stop sharing your presentation so we can show you on the screen, that'd be great. So the first question we have is from Jessica, And she's asking, how do you motivate steering committee members who have already full-time roles, not related to their steering committee work, that are working on a small stipend? They aren't quite volunteers, but have weekly and monthly meetings and assignments with work that has grant-based outcomes. It is easy to get steering committee members to sign up, but not members that are motivated to be outcome-based, to attend the meetings and complete assignments that are required of the role.
That was a long question. Let's start that over and let's try to dissect it into several questions. Read it back to me.
Okay, so the first part is, how do you motivate steering committee members who don't have full-time roles, which are
Okay, well,
not?
let's stop there.
Okay,
Let's stop there. I assume you're talking about strategic planning steering committees. Is that what we're talking about, or are we talking about the full board of directors as the steering committee?
Jessica,
It's
you want to
both.
chime in on that?
It's both. They're an advisory board of some kind, but it is about strategic planning.
I'm sorry, one more time.
It's an advisory board, but it's also about strategic planning.
Okay, well, first of all, I would be very selective. Remember back to my slide that I talked about the things that were required for your steering committee. You needed a leadership cadre that was knowledgeable, courageous, good interpersonal skills, and committed to the effort. I would not put somebody on a steering committee if I had the feeling that they were going to be a roadblock. The only time that I would ever do something like that is if I knew someone was a thought leader who had a large sway in the organization, and it would be best to bring them on board early on to have them help in the process, as opposed to being outside and snipping at it as we went along. Okay, so what I'm saying there is your steering committee should be strongly committed to the mission and to the change. And if they're not, you need to get the peers to either bring them on board or replace them, because you can't have a bad apple in your change efforts. And your second part of the question was what? There was something about stipends.
So well, one, I should say that, what if the CEO just says, we just need bodies, and you are trying to be selective to be more strategic, but that's not the CEO's perspective. And then secondly, they're working off of a stipend. So they already have full-time roles in a full-time job, right? So
I lost your voice.
It's hard to get committed people who are because it's a small stipend to fulfill assignments and attend meetings regularly if a CEO is not interested in strategic people.
The CEO's not interested? Well, you got a real problem. And that's when the board needs to take over. If the CEO, hopefully the board will attend presentations like this one we're giving, or like the presentations that Kim Open, who's on this call, puts on as part of Jericho Road, Pasadena. We got to make sure that they understand what the role is and how they can contribute. And we need to build a strong board, and we just got to bring on people. And if the board is what's standing in the way, then we've got a longer term process, because we gradually need to weed them out. And one way of weeding them out is have term limits. So you have to make a conscious effort to bring them back or keep them on, or else they automatically fall off. So what you could have is say a 2-year term, and maybe a limit of 2 2-year terms before they have to leave the board. So you could use term limits as a way to recruit the right people onto the board. If you don't have the right people on the board and the CEO is not interested in improving the organization, you've got about as big a mess as you can get. And personally, if I were in a situation like that, I have certain psychic needs as an individual. And so if I'm not getting them out of that organization, if I just see a bunch of clowns that are stumbling along and barely meeting their mission, I'm going to go someplace where I can make a difference. But that's me. You know, I'm not a big believer in stipends, but sometimes they're important. If you can't pay the minimum wage that the state has put on us, or the city of Pasadena, then a stipend may be the way to do that. A volunteer with a stipend, that might help. But generally, I have found that people that do the work in and for nonprofits are not necessarily fiscally oriented. You know, most of us that work in nonprofit organizations, we know that our salary is not going to be this up to the same thing that a person in the for-profit sector is going to be. You know, we know that we're giving up a little bit in the way of salary or stipend, but we're contributing that in terms of psychic reward and benefits for society. So, you know, it's getting the right people. Jim Collins again, I love the way he puts things. He goes, before you can make your organization excellent, you got to get the right people on the bus. And, you know, that's what it's all about. You got to get the right people and then train them on the organization and train them on the right thing to do. There will be some other opportunities for seminars with me where we'll talk more about how to build that board and get the right people on board. I'm sorry I don't have time to do that all today, but I hope that helps a little bit.
Yes, thank you so much.
Okay. Anybody else?
Okay, Mitch, our next question is from Genevieve. She said, you mentioned a volunteer handbook. Are you referring to the board, all volunteers, or separate handbooks for both groups?
Both and separate. A board handbook is going to talk about more about the organization. It's going to provide things like minutes, bylaws, past history, past accomplishments. It's got to have what you expect from them, what the disciplinary procedures are. There's all kinds of things that would go into a board handbook, that including things like give or get. Some of you are development people and you're raising money. A lot of organizations have in their board handbook some kind of an agreement that the board member signs that says, I agree to give or get X number of dollars for the organization. So those are all things that you can do to get the board up to speed. I recommend a volunteer handbook for a number of reasons. One, whether you realize it or not, volunteers, if they come in and sexually harass or do things to your employees or to other volunteers, you have a legal liability to make sure that that doesn't happen. And so you've got to have in your volunteer handbook, you've got to have what's acceptable behavior, what's not acceptable behavior. You got to document what the due process will be if they violate those acceptable procedures, which could include stuff like suspension or even elimination from the organization. But you should have that documented so that nobody sues you after you fire them or ask them to leave the organization. You want to have your adverse action procedures and policies documented in that volunteer handbook. You want to put down an agreement for them that they'll serve so many hours. In the Tournament of Roses, one of the things in the volunteer handbook says you're expected to work X number of hours a year, attend Y percentage of meetings, and spend $300 to buy yourself a white suit. So there are expectations that you want volunteers to know, both on the positive side and on the negative side. Does that answer that question, or did I miss part of it? In other
No,
words,
that's helpful, thank you.
Bottom line is a handbook for each dedicated to the specifics of that particular group.
Great. Okay, so the next question comes from Sylvia, and she's asking, as a CEO, how do you operate at a 30,000-foot level with all the darn dailies that consume you?
You know, that's the challenge of being the CEO. And I probably should have added an 11th thing on there, which says that you got to prioritize. When I was going to be a base commander back 100 years ago, I went to a training program, and the guy that was giving the training program was a very senior officer who had been through it all before. And one of the things that he said was, never confuse paperwork for real work. And I've always remembered that it's important to keep your priorities. Always keep the mission at the forefront and the things that contribute directly to the mission at the forefront, because that's what's going to make the organization succeed. Some of the paperwork or some of the minor things can be delayed or put off for a little bit of time, but it's all up to the CEO to recognize what's important and what's not. And if I'm a board member, and I assume we have a board member or two in the audience out there, the board is there to help you with those priorities. They can help you figure out what they feel is the most important thing to do and what are things that might be postponed. I used to have a guy that worked for me who was a genius, but he was very sensitive to pressure. And he used to come to me about once a year and say, Mitch, I'm at the breaking point. And I said, well, give me the list of the things that are bothering you. And he would lay out this list of things. And this is basic for any psychologists in the room. This is basic to relieving pressure on yourself. So what he would do is he'd read me off all the things that he had to do. And I would say, well, don't do that one. Do this one, but only halfway. Give this one priority. And we'd go through the whole list. And at the end of the whole list, he would go to me and he would go, thank you. Now I know what I need to do. And I can do that without laying awake at night. So that's one technique. And that's if you're a CEO. But if you're a board chair, you need to recognize the symptoms of stress in your CEO and your senior staff. And if they are having problems, you need to talk to them and try to help them with the right sort of priorities. I hope that helps.
Thank you.
Okay, our next question comes from Jessica, and I hope I'm reading it right. If not, please correct me. It says, how do you prepare to share a plan with a CEO who only wants to hear the good news and not, rather than how to co-create contingency plans and innovative solutions that were not a part of the plan, that was not responsive to scopes or grants what the client needs?
So we're saying here that the CEO doesn't want to play the game. Is that what we're saying?
Right.
Right? Fire him. I mean, the simple answer is if the CEO is not interested in change and is just interested in plodding along, then the board should recognize, if the board is doing their work, and one of the basic functions of a board is oversight, okay? And this is another presentation, but I'll bring it up now. There are three things that the board needs to provide oversight on. They have oversight of programs and mission performance. They have oversight of the CEO and how that CEO is carrying out the mission. And they have oversight of the board itself. Are they aware of their responsibilities and are they carrying them out? And so if the board is properly trained and is properly aware of the organization, then they need to counsel that CEO and get the CEO going in the right direction, or they need to replace it. It's that simple. Either that or they gotta accept and tell the donors that we're probably going to fail in a few years. And nobody wants to do that. So, you know, you have to be brutal in some cases. If somebody's not doing the job, you got to part ways with them. even though they might be doing a few things good, there are excellent people out there with an interest in your organization that will carry that out. And that's the board, that is one of the fundamental board responsibilities, is to know how the organization is doing and how the CEO is contributing to that. Hope that helps.
Thank you.
Okay, Mitch, our next question comes from Christina, and she asks, how do you institutionalize good decision-making?
Well, there's nothing magic about good decision-making. And if you go online or read any books on leadership or management or any of those type of things, they'll just talk about good decision-making. Good decision-making basically evolves around what is the problem that I'm trying to solve? And two, what are the resources that I have now? And see, what do I need to carry that out? What do I need to change? And then what you want to do is in the planning process, you want to take a look at all the different ways that you might be able to work around something that's problematic. It may be more communications. It may be turning to a different set of donors. There may be all kinds of different ways to work around that. But you've got to understand where it is that you want to go. What are the obstacles that are in the way? What are the possible ways to get there? And let's evaluate the pros and cons of each of those options. And then you want to pick the best one, hopefully using some sort of a group dynamic. Psychologists have discovered, and I don't know if we've got any psychologists out there today, but one of the studies that I read years ago was the ideal size for a group for decision-making process was about 5 people. But it maintained itself up until about 8 people. So somewhere between 5 and 8 in your decision-making group is likely to properly examine, talk out, and select the best options. Beyond about 8 people, it starts getting murkier because you have more people that need to talk, more ideas that need to come in, and it may or may not be positive. But I've seen studies that say if you go beyond 8 people or so in your decision-making group, you're probably not achieving the optimum. So I guess the answer is get a group decision-making process of the right size and then follow that basic decision-making process. And you can go online and ask, define a good decision-making process, and you'll find it laid out for you pretty specifically. But I think that's what I would do.
Okay, the next question is from Sylvia, and she asks, in a new CEO role, what would your top 3 priorities be?
The first priority is to know what the mission is. Where is the organization? And that's what I recommend that anybody come in to do, is to figure out where is the organization. Is it doing well? Is it doing poorly? Why is it doing well? Why is it not? And you get that by talking to people. You talk to everybody that's a thought leader. You talk to your senior staff. You talk to your junior staff. You talk to your donors. You talk to your community stakeholders or your beneficiaries. You talk to the board. You build a picture of the organization. So that's the first thing, is I got to know what the organization is trying to do and how well it's doing now. The next thing I want to do is I want to focus on the people. I want to know how happy they are. And basically this all comes at the same time. You can't do this. You got to do these in parallel, not in sequence. So you got to understand the people. Who are they? How are they trained? Where did they come from? What are their goals? What are their aspirations? And what are their shortcomings? You know, I found it remarkable that in some of the organizations, when I was doing annual evaluations, I would say to the individual employee, what is it that you want to do better? And how can I help you do that? And you would be surprised how honest the people were about telling me What is it that they need to do? Okay, and the third thing that I would look at again is the resources. You know, how is our facility? Do we have enough people? Do we have enough volunteers? And how is the money? If the money's falling short from what we want to do, how do I get more money? And there's lots of ways to do this. One of my favorite stories, or one of my favorite histories, is a group called Homeboy Industries. Does anybody know that organization? It was created by a guy by the name of Father Boyle down in downtown. And it started off as an organization that would remove tattoos from gang members. And it evolved over the years because it wasn't raising enough money to remove the tattoos for the people that wanted to have them removed, was that they started a bunch of businesses and used the beneficiaries as members of that. And now if you go onto the Homeboy network, you will find out that they've got about 12 different money-making operations. And so that's an example of the third thing that you ought to do. Look at the resources, and if the resources aren't there, figure out what you can do with what you have to raise more money. And so the answer very quickly: mission, mission and performance, people, and money.
Okay, and we have a question from Peter. He's asking, what is your opinion about teaching staff how to engage in good decision-making? It can be taught, it's not genetic, yes?
It absolutely can be taught. And, you know, I am a big believer, as you saw in my slide there, about preparing the organization for your departure. One of the things, an ideal situation is if you think that you could walk out the door, never come back, and the organization would keep going. And so you want to train your subordinates in whatever they need to carry out their job. And if that's good decision-making, there's a number of training courses that are available for that. And so again, just go online. There are organizations in every town that operate things for nonprofits, that you can take the courses or get a consultant or whatever it is to help your people understand the right process. So bottom line is, I'm a big believer in training as well as performance for your subordinates, and you can train them to be the person that you want them to be.
Okay, Mitch, that was all of the questions that I received in the chat. So if you want to open it up for anybody to ask questions.
Hey, Mitch, Seth Walworth. We've had lunch before, and I listened to one of your previous talks at Envision, and I've distributed far and wide. I'm going to distribute this far and wide. You should be a commencement speaker. I'm serious. This is terrific, and
I actually have been a commencement speaker on a couple of occasions.
well, you should be required to do it. You should be required to do it every year. I'm former board chair of the All People's Community Center, and we are in the midst of a very pivotal year here where we're going to be looking for a new executive director to replace really a civic treasurer that's been with us for the last 40 years. And so this is spectacular. I will spread this far and wide, and that will include a bunch of Anderson MBA interns that we bring in every year to serve on our board. So
Good.
Your wisdom will go far and wide, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. I was going to say something there. Oh, well, senior moment. I'll get back to it. Any other questions?
Yeah, hi, Mitch. My name is Jewel
Hi,
Delaval.
Jewel. I've been
Hi,
watching you the whole presentation. I only get to see about 4 people, but you're one of them. Hi.
Oh, wonderful. Hi. I'm the Chief Program Officer at a place called Home. I've really
I know
enjoyed.
it.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
I know that organization.
Oh, okay, wonderful. One, I was going to ask, can we have your contact information for any kind of consulting in the future? And two, you talk about succession planning, and specifically, my question is, how do you continue to build your own internal staff to possibly be a successor for a COO or a CPO? What kind of professional development do you think is needed to really get the team to that, to basically have the opportunity to possibly recruit from within versus having to recruit from without?
Yeah, I was going to answer. Let me go back and answer the question that I forgot what I was going to say. And that is, if you're getting ready to hire a new executive director, Seth, you probably want to hire somebody that can go in there and take a hard look at your organization and what it needs and what it wants. And this particular presentation is being sponsored by Envision Nonprofit Consulting. And they have an excellent process to help you figure out what organizations need and what characteristics your new executive director will be. And you may want to talk to Matt or Allison or one of the other excellent consultants at Envision and at least go through their process to figure out what you need as you go forward. Now, let me go back to this Jules question, which was, how do you train people to be ready to take on new responsibilities? This is one of the biggest problems that I faced in my nonprofit world. In a big nonprofit, what you do is you move people laterally. I was just working with a group, Habitat for Humanity, and what their particular staff now has been in other positions within the organization. So what they've done is they've laterally transferred people around to learn new skills and abilities. And that is a wonderful way to do it. Unfortunately, if your staff is not large enough, then you don't have a way to move them, which is always the best way. Best way is to move and have them learn new things. If you can't have them in a new job, try to get your subordinates on their own to learn about the other elements of the organization. I had a guy in a small organization a number of years ago who said, I want to be a CEO, but I'm not ready. How do I get there? So I interviewed him and I talked about what he knew and what he didn't know. And I saw there were a great many things that he was an expert on, and there were some things that he didn't have a clue on. And one of the things that I told him to do was to go and talk to the people that are actually doing the job that you want to be able to do. So in other words, if you're not a finance person, take the finance person out to lunch, ask them a lot of questions, learn about what their problems are, learn about things that you can read. Reading is always another good area. Look for training courses that will help them become better supervisors. I know that I think it's a Center for Nonprofit Management, but I'm not sure. But there's one that's running a course right now about how to be a better supervisor. So there are courses out there that people can take to expand their horizons. Meeting with people in different functional areas, having lunches with them, just spend time with them, ask questions. Those are all ways that you can build somebody to prepare them to be the CEO. If that's what the goal is, if the board says we want to hire from within, if it's at all possible, then we want to train somebody, and that's all part of succession planning, which is another presentation, altogether. But one of the things that you want to do is, if the board wants to hire somebody, they got to make sure that they're the right person, and they do that by interviewing them and testing their skills and that sort of thing. And if they find they don't have it, then build a training program for them to get there in one way or another.
Thank you so much.
There's an interesting story about a guy, I forget his name now, but he used to be the president of ESPN. when I was working with the Rose Bowl game. This guy started in the mailroom. He was literally one of the guys that delivered packages and letters to the other offices. And he just moved back and forth across the organization in the various jobs. And then all of a sudden, after a number of years, of course, he's now the CEO. He's the president of ESPN, and he started in the mailroom. And that's because ESPN had a big enough organization that they could move him around internally. Sometimes in nonprofits, what you have to do is you have to tell an employee, you got to go someplace else to grow. And that's a hard thing to do, and it's hard for the organization. But sometimes the only way that they can get a bigger picture is to go to another organization in a slightly higher position, and then maybe come back once they've learned what they needed to learn. That's a harsh way, but it's effective.
Mitch, we have about 5 minutes left, and I have 2 questions to pose to you. I have one from Christina, and she says that while building up the team aspect of the board, how do we combat the attitude assumption of someone else will do it from the individuals?
Whoa, I didn't follow that. Can you try me again?
While building up the team aspect of the board, how do
Yeah.
we combat the attitude / assumption of, quote, someone else will do it, unquote, from individuals?
Is that a board member that feels that way or a staff member?
The board.
Okay. Well, that's not a good board member. For one thing, they've all got to some, when you select your board members, and what I recommend that you do is, and this is a whole different presentation too, but when you're selecting board members, you don't just hire the first person that steps forward. You want to hire a person that understands the organization, has a passion for the organization. And then as you bring them on board, you want to properly vet them, make sure that people like them, make sure that they can get along with the other people on your board. Find out what their attitudes are as part of the vetting process. And if they fail the vetting process, don't ask them to join the board. But the big point that I want to make on this is you don't just look around and hire your buddies to be board members. You don't necessarily want to hire the person that walks in off the street as your next board member. You want to know who has the passion, who has the skills, and how do they get along with the others, and make sure that they're right for the organization. The only other thing that I might advise is if you've got a person like that, then the board leadership, the officers of the organization need to sit down with the person, and they need, as part of their annual board evaluation of itself, they need to go to this person and say, you know what, you're not helping us move this institution forward. You either need to get on board or you need to step aside. And again, that's harsh. Or maybe you find a different capacity for them. Maybe you make them a board member emeritus or something where they don't have a decision-making or leadership role, but they're still around in an advisory capacity. There's all sorts of ways that you might think about doing that, but those are just some.
Okay, thank you. And the last question is from Sylvia. She says, what suggestions do you have to build a CEO network? Do some already exist?
That's, I think, is terribly important. When I was at the Claremont colleges, there are 7 colleges over there. And one of the things that the people used to say is that the best benefit of working in the Claremont colleges is that there are 7 other people real close by that are doing the same job. And so I've always been a big believer in coordinating committees of CEOs or collaborating committees. And I think if whoever asked the question is in Pasadena, I think there is a group, there's a CEO cooperative organization that gets together and meets and talks about problems. That's very, very valuable. If you don't do that, then what I would try to figure out is who do I admire and how can I get to know that person that I admire better? can I ask them out to lunch? I did this once with a guy that had a big nonprofit over in Pomona. And I asked him out to meet some of my key people. And in an hour and a half lunch, he gave us so much, it was like a master's degree course in how to be a CEO and how to build successful organizations. So if you find somebody that you really admire, you know, bring them in as a speaker, have them for lunch or whatever, so that you can share their wisdom. So there's two real answers there: collaboration organizations and people that you admire that you get to know personally. Is Kim still on?
Still here.
Are you working with that Pasadena CEO collaboration coordinating committee?
Yeah, I put it in the chat. It's the Pasadena Executive Roundtable, or PERT.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's another organization called Vistage, Vistage, which is an organization that brings CEOs in the for-profit world together to share topics and discussions and that sort of thing. So there's a recognition both in the for-profit world and the nonprofit world that collaborative roundtables and that sort of thing are extremely important for people to learn and stay up with the latest that's happening. And whoops, I just hit 12 o'clock. Is there any last questions? Okay, well, in that case, I want to thank you all again. I put up my big slide that thanks you all for doing what you're doing, because you're really making a difference in the lives of people and you're really enriching the communities that we live in. So I have to thank you from the bottom of my heart for doing that. Thanks so much, and
Thank you,
have a
Matt.
great day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mitch. Thank you,
You
Matt.
bet.